So we're going to talk about just a quick review here of the circulatory flow for the heart here. Keep in mind, all right, the circulation for the heart, the coronary circulation, comes off of the ascending aorta. So as the blood is leaving the heart, it passes through the aortic pulmonary valve. You've got this part. Here's your arch of the aorta. Okay, and here's the heart over here. Okay, so this part right here is the ascending aorta. And so you have two blood vessels that come off of the ascending aorta. Okay, and that's the left and right coronary arteries. And we learned about that when we were talking about the blood vessels from our last test here. Okay, so left and right coronary arteries. And then those are the first blood vessels that come off the aorta. Then we get into the arch, and there's three, all right, branches that come off of the arch of the aorta. And we're going to talk about those now. Okay, so the first of the three is called the brachiocephalic trunk. Now, if you look at that, brachial means arm, cephalic is head. So this named artery is basically telling you what it's going to supply. Okay, the brachiocephalic trunk is going to divide or bifurcate into the right common carotid artery, and that's going to go up into your neck and supply the right side of your head and the right side of your neck. Okay, that's going to be the right common carotid. The right subclavian, clavian, then clavicle. Okay, this one, the right subclavian, is going to supply, all right, your right upper extremity, right, and also parts of the thoracic wall there. Okay, so right common carotid is going to be the right side of your head and neck. Right subclavian, upper limb, right upper limb, actually, to be specific, and some of the thoracic structures in the thoracic wall there. Okay, that's the first branch off of the aortic arch. The second one is the left common carotid. Well, we know what the right common carotid does. Okay, so left common carotid is going to supply the left side of your head and neck. And then the left subclavian, again, we know what the right subclavian does. So the left subclavian is going to supply your left upper extremity and then some of the structures there in the thoracic cavity there.
Why is it only one for the right side?
I know, it's really interesting, and part of that has to do with, one, pressure that's coming out, the amount of blood that's coming out. The brachiocephalic is the largest blood vessel. I think the next slide on here is a picture of it. There you go. All right. The brachiocephalic trunk is larger than the left common carotid and the left subclavian. So part of that has to do with pressure that's coming out, because there's a ton. It's about.
So are these going to be on our?
This will be on your test. Is that what your question is? Yeah. Well, some of it though, but since we're doing the circulatory system, you're responsible for it here. I won't be asking you like the heart structure. You should know like the ventricles, obviously, but I'm not going to ask you the coronary blood vessels and all that, because that was already tested. But you should be able to tell. I mean, I can almost guarantee you on the second lab exam, you will have one of those three that I just talked about. It'll be labeled. It usually always is. All right. So you just want to be familiar. You can't really see. Well, you can see the right coronary artery and then the left coronary coming off over here. All right. But here's the arch of the ascending aorta. Be very careful. Right, that you know that the ascending aorta it's a small part of the overall aorta. Because then when we get in here where it's kind of arching here, that's the aortic arch, and then the descending aorta is over here. It's kind of cut off. Brachiocephalic trunk, which will then divide into your right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. All right, then we have our left common carotid artery and then our left subclavian artery. Okay. Anything else on here?
What are those little things called?
Which?
On the other little things.
Over here?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about those. Some of those are going to be some of the intercostal arteries, esophageal arteries. Okay. Usually, I won't on the test put an artery on there if you can't tell where it's going to, because it's very hard to distinguish that from other ones. You know. All right, so when we're talking about the aorta, okay, once we leave the arch of the aorta starts to descend down. When it's in the thoracic cavity, we refer to it as the thoracic aorta, specifically the descending thoracic aorta. And once it pierces through and punches through the diaphragm, when it comes out the other side of the diaphragm, then we call it the descending abdominal aorta, because at that point, we're in the abdominal cavity, okay? The descending abdominal aorta will then bifurcate and split off into your common iliac arteries, okay? You've got a right and a left common iliac artery. Remember the iliac bone? All right, so we're kind of close to the iliac bone, which is part of your hips, your pelvis there. And usually the abdominal aorta will bifurcate around L4, L5, all right, when we're talking about the vertebral level, okay? And at that point, then the right and the left common iliacs will then bifurcate again into the left external iliac and the left internal iliac. And the same thing goes for the right. We'll talk about that. But these iliac arteries, all right, the internal one is going to supply all these organs and structures in the pelvic cavity. The external is going to continue on down into the leg, right? And that's going to provide blood for the lower extremity. Okay, we'll talk about that. All right, so abdominal aorta is going to split into the right and left common iliac arteries, and then those common iliac arteries will then bifurcate or split into the external and the internal iliac arteries. All right. So if you need, you can get your phone out and take a picture of this if you'd like. When you folks at home, same thing at home. If you want to take a picture of the screen, you will see this. All right, so this is kind of what we're seeing here. Here's the descending thoracic aorta, all right, and you have these branches here, all right, that are running on the inferior surface, all right, of the ribs. And those are the intercostal arteries. Okay, those intercostal arteries will run on the inferior surface of the ribs here. Okay, so the descending thoracic aorta goes down through the thoracic cavity, punches through the diaphragm here. Once it pierces through the diaphragm, it is now known as the descending abdominal aorta. And then it bifurcates around L4, L5 into your right and left common iliac arteries. And then the right and left common iliac arteries will then bifurcate into the external iliac artery, which will go on into the leg, and the internal iliac artery, which will then supply all these structures down here in the pelvis. Okay, good so far? Not too bad? All right. All right, so that's the arterial blood flow. Now, let's talk about the venous blood flow coming into the heart. Okay? So, venous return for the heart, we're talking about the right atrium, includes three structures: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and then the coronary circulation. All right, we have that coronary sinus, that like sac-like structure that sits around the base of the heart. All right, well, that is going to be the venous return blood flow for the heart. All right, so those are those three structures that are going to drain into our right atrium. Okay, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus. Okay, so the two veins that will actually come together and merge and form the superior vena cava are going to be your right and left brachiocephalic veins. Again, there's that term, brachiocephalic. Brachios being arm, cephalic is going to be the head. All right, so these veins essentially are going to be draining, all right, the head, the neck, both your left and right limbs, upper limbs, upper extremities, and then parts of the thoracic and also the abdominal walls. So that's a lot of blood that's getting dumped into the superior vena cava. All right, the inferior vena cava is basically going to bring blood back from our lower extremities, all right, parts of the abdominal cavity, all right, all those organs there, all right, pelvis. If you're not familiar with this term here, the perineum, That's the floor of your pelvis. That's what holds your guts in. Okay. Otherwise, if you didn't have the perineum there, all your guts and your pelvis would spill out. Not literally like that, but all right. But that's essentially the floor of your pelvis there. All right. Now, in front of your spine is usually where we're going to find the aorta. All right. The descending aorta is going to be in front of the spine. The inferior vena cava is going to sit just to the right. All right. So for the most part, you want to consider, all right, directly, if your spine is the central axis of your body, of your axial skeleton, right in front of that is going to be the abdominal aorta and the thoracic descending aorta. All right. To the right of that is going to be where we're going to find the inferior vena cava. All right. And then, of course, the coronary sinus, that's going to be all the venous return blood, all right, that comes from the heart and it gets dumped into the right atrium. So it has that deoxygenated blood there. All right, so here's our first slide for labeling, okay? In case you haven't labeled this, I'll walk you through it. All right, so let's start up here, because if we're going to go with the venous return, I'm going to start more peripherally and work my way towards the heart. So when we're in the neck here, this number 8, these two blood vessels on the left and right side of your neck, all right, those are the internal jugular veins. So obviously this is on the anatomical left side, so this is the left internal jugular vein. This is the right internal jugular vein. All right. Also, we're seeing, all right, from the periphery here, this right here, all right, is the right brachial vein. The right brachial vein, brachial is arm, okay? And you can see right here above, this guy is the right cephalic vein. You'll see, you know, if you've ever seen in bodybuilders or athletes, they have that one vein that's popping out on their bicep. This is that vein, in case you're wondering. That cephalic vein is going to be the one that's very well pronounced. Because you have several, this is when we were talking about those different types of anastomoses, all right? And so this is a venous anastomosis. You have several different veins that are going to drain the upper extremity here. So this top, all right, vein right here is the cephalic vein. And this guy here, the brachial vein. The brachial vein is a continuation of the axial vein. So essentially, it's like the roads here in Greenville. Have you ever driven down a road here in Greenville and you haven't turned off the road and yet it's called a different name? You know, I think Eastleigh Road is one of those, Brushy Creek Road in Taylor's. Anyways, that's something new to me when I first moved here. I wasn't really quite sure. And so I was like, I swear to you, I didn't make a turn, but now it's not called the street that I thought. Well, that's what we're seeing here, right? With these veins here, right, it's actually changes names, right, when it's in a different part of the body. So when we're here in the arm, and you can use the humerus, you can see the humerus here, down here by the shaft of the humerus, all right, this is the brachial vein, because we're in the arm, in the brachium. All right, as we get closer to the armpit, all right, then we call this vein here the axillary vein. And then as we start to approach, all right, where the heart is, the sternum and all that, this part of the vein is called the subclavian vein. Now you can't see it, all right, but if the collarbone, excuse me, I apologize, if the clavicle were here, all right, it would be right over here. And so the vein that's right below the clavicle is the subclavian vein, okay? So when the subclavian vein on the right side here meets up with the internal jugular vein, they come together and they form, right, your right brachiocephalic vein. So that little black line that is representing the right brachiocephalic vein. Okay?
What's VV?
Just vein, yeah.
And what's V?
Vein. That means nothing.
What's
So
vessel?
AA is what?
Then what's vessel?
Vessel? Well, vessel could mean a lymphatic vessel or a blood vessel.
This is vein. It's not V. No, they look similar.
Oh, right. Oh, venous vessel. I always just call it vein. VV. So again, where we're seeing, all right, these two blood vessels coming together, all right, the subclavian vein here and the internal jugular vein coming together, that's what forms our right brachiocephalic vein. And then over here on the other side, you can see here on the left side, here's our left internal jugular vein. It's going to meet up with the left subclavian vein, and where they come together, this is a little bit longer structure, right? This is the left brachiocephalic vein, right here, this whole thing. So where both the brachiocephalic veins come together, they're going to form the superior vena cava. You guys see that? Kind of, sort of? All right.
How big is it? Like the superior vena cava diameter?
Close to about, it varies from person to person depending on the size, but about, I was going to use a coin, I'd say about a nickel. Quarter would be too big, but diameter of a nickel.
That's still pretty big.
Oh yeah, yep, it's pretty decent. All right, all right. Now let's go into the head and neck. All right, we're going to jump back over to the arteries here. So there's going to be a lot. All right, and it's so we're going to start off first with our common carotid arteries. Okay, so the common carotid artery will bifurcate into an internal and an external carotid artery. Right, but most of the blood, all right, that comes to your head and neck come from the common carotid arteries. 80% of the blood that goes to your to your brain comes from the internal carotid artery. So the point being is most of the blood, all right, comes from these two arteries, the left and the right common carotid. Okay? So the external is going to supply everything on the outside of the skull. The internal is going to supply the internal skull structures. Brain, blood vessels there, the tissues in there, all right? So keep that in mind. Three other branches, all right, that we see that come off of the subclavian artery are going to be the arterial artery. Did I say arterial artery? Oh my gosh. Today's only Monday. It's not Friday. All right, it's the vertebral artery. So this guy right here, the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery, both of these blood vessels supply the blood to your brain. The internal supplies 80%, and the vertebral arteries supply 20%. Okay, so those two blood vessels. It's just a FYI. Just know that the majority of the blood that's supplied to your brain comes from the internal carotid arteries. Okay. So when we're talking about our subclavian artery, all right, the three branches that we're going to talk about are going to be the vertebral artery. And if you look at the names, folks, sometimes if you're not sure, just step back and take a look at the name of the blood vessel. It tells you what it's supplying for the most part, not all of them, or also what it's draining if we're talking about a venous blood vessel. Right? Vertebral artery, right? That's going to go up towards the brain there, spine. Thyrocervical is going to be the thyroid gland and part of the neck and shoulder. And then costo is going to be ribs or thoracic cavity, right? And the neck again, right? So this is going to be more deep neck, but also intercostals. If you look at the names, just dissect them if you're not sure, okay? Now this is going to be, I'm not expecting you guys to be able to tell me which of these blood vessels does what, all right? All right, but you can tell by the name. What do you think the facial artery does? It supplies the face, all right? Really, seriously, this is one of the few times where anatomists were like, hey, you know what? Let's kind of make this easy to learn and just name these things for what they do or what they supply. And you can see the superior thyroid artery is going to descend. Here's your thyroid gland. It descends upon the thyroid gland and it supplies the thyroid gland. All right? And so we call it the superior thyroid artery because there is another artery that comes up from the inferior portion that supplies the thyroid gland. So this one descends, or it's superior to the thyroid. Okay? So it's going to supply the thyroid gland and parts of your voice box. All right? Ascending pharyngeal. Again, Think of pharyngeal, that's your throat. All right, the pharynx, the oral pharynx, and the nasal pharynx, nose and throat. All right, so this is going to supply the pharynx, lingual, tongue, facial, face, occipital, that's the head. Well, where's the occipital bone located? On the back. All right, posterior scalp. Posterior auricular. Auricular has to do with your ears. All right, that thing that sits on the side of your head, known as the pinna, it's also called the auricle. Okay, that's your part of your ear. So the posterior auricular artery is going to supply your ears and parts of the lateral portion of your scalp. All right, maxillary artery. You all remember where your maxillary bone is, right? That's your upper jaw, around your nose and your upper teeth. Check it out. Teeth, gums, nasal cavity, mastication muscles, temporalis. All right, you also have the masseter. Where do they sit? On the side of your jaw and on the side of your face. Okay, superficial temporal artery. All right, again, lateral portion, superior portion of your head, but also, what's the parotid gland? We haven't learned that yet, but that is going to be one of the digestive glands that sits right near in front of your ear. All right, right by your jaw there. Okay, that's the superficial temporal artery. All right, so bust out your manuals there, your atlas, your atli. Okay, so we're going to see it. There's a couple slides in here. It's going to repeat here. You should have all this down here at least labeled. All right, superior vena cava, right and left brachiocephalic veins. Okay, and then you've got your right subclavian vein, left subclavian vein. This branch here that comes off, or I shouldn't say comes off, because actually it's joining. All right, this is the cephalic, all right, vein here, and this. Flip that. Veins are blue, arteries are red. Yeah, because the red's to signify oxygenated blood. Yeah. So, and then we have our axillary vein here, and then down here is our brachial vein. Okay, when we're down in the arm, it's brachial. When we're in the armpit, it's axillary. And then when we're up here, all right, closer to the internal jugular, all right, then it's going to be the subclavian vein. So here's your two internal jugular veins. All right, so now we have a couple new structures here that we're throwing in here. All right, if you look here, here's the arch of the aorta. All right, and then our first branch you can't really see because it's obstructed, all right, by the left brachiocephalic vein, but it splits. All right, so here's your subclavian artery, specifically the right subclavian artery here, and then you have your common carotid artery here and here. So this would be the right common carotid artery. This is the left common carotid artery. All right. So before I go up into the carotids here, let's stay here by the subclavian vein. All right, this branch here that you're seeing right here, and again, it's tough to see, all right, but this is supposed to represent, all right, the vertebral artery. And you can see it a little bit better. It's supposed to be running up. There's a better version of it, but this is the vertebral artery here and over here, because that's going to head up in the transverse. Remember the transverse foramen in the vertebrae, those little holes that sat on either side of the vertebral body, right? And I hope that your instructor told you what went into those transverse foramen in the cervical spine. Well, one, the cervical spine is the only vertebra that has a transverse foramen. And that's where the vertebral artery sits, right in that transverse foramen. And then this lateral artery right here, all right, that is your right thyrocervical artery. Okay, you can see, right, it's going to head up to the deeper structures of the neck here, and then parts of the thoracic cavity here. All right, now, following our common carotid artery, it's now ascending. You can't see where it's branching, all right? But it branches the common carotid into the internal common carotid, into the internal carotid and the external carotid. The internal carotid makes a beeline straight for the brain. It will not branch, okay? So there should be you will not see any branches coming off of the internal carotid, right? Because it's going to enter through the carotid canal. Remember the carotid canal at the inferior portion of your skull? When the common carotid artery divides or bifurcates into the external carotid and the internal carotid, the external carotid's first branch that it gives off is this guy here, and it's going downwards. That is going to be, all right, this is the left external carotid. This is the left, all right, superior thyroid artery. The thyroid gland is right over here. Okay. Then the next branch that we see off the external carotid is this guy. And it runs right along the face. So this is the left facial artery. And what's running with it? A companion vessel, which is blue. So that's the left facial vein. Okay. Then as we follow the external carotid up further and further, we have another branch. This one is kind of going straight across. All right. So this one is another facial vessel, but it's more transverse, so we call it the transverse facial artery. And then there's a common vessel with it. It's companion vessel, which is the left transverse vein. And then as we continue upwards here on the lateral portion of the skull, way up to the top here, then we have our left superficial temporal, because the temporal bone is right over here, right where it branches off. And it goes up to the top of the head here. So that's the left superficial temporal artery with its companion vessel, which is the left superficial temporal vein. Okay. Now what we've done here is, now be careful when you're labeling these, because some of these numbers are blue and some are black. Okay, so don't confuse them when you're labeling. You should have this. This is basically just a zoomed in version of what I just showed you. All right. Well, blue is just going to be the see, these are blue numbers, and then you have some black numbers in there. So that corresponds to these. The blue ones will correspond with these. So I'll just run through it here. Just make sure, double check, make sure you got everything labeled. All right. This right here is going to be your common carotid artery. In fact, this is going to be the left common carotid. All right. It bifurcates into the internal carotid, which goes right up into the skull. Does not branch. It does not have any branches coming off of it. The external carotid artery gives off its first branch, which goes downwards here, and that's going to be the left superior thyroid artery. Then it gives off another branch that just kind of runs at a diagonal across the face here, right? And that's going to be the left facial artery with its companion vessel, the left facial vein, right? And then you can see here, right, this vessel right here, this blue vessel, that's the external jugular vein, and it's making a beeline towards the jugular foramen. Remember the jugular foramen, that hole that sat next to the foramen? It was just lateral to the occipital condyles and the foramen magnum. All right, and again, this vein here drains the cranial cavity. All right, we'll get into the vessels up inside the cranium, but again, a lot of the blood that is drained from your skull is going to travel in the internal jugular vein. Right, and then up here, again, you can see our superficial. Here's the left superficial temporal artery and vein. Okay. All right. Questions so far? All right. Okay. So let's look at a little bit. Is that, I am not sure if that is in your, it is in there? Oh, good. Perfect. Yes. All right. Good, good, good. All right, so keep in mind, this one here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this one. I'll back out a little bit, but I'll show you the letters. I just want to show this one part here, okay? So here, number 6, that is going to be your right, because obviously we're looking at the right side of the skull, all right? So you should know that. This is the right side, all right? So here is your right common carotid artery, and then it divides or bifurcates here. Okay, and you have one, whoops, this division here, it goes straight up and makes a beeline for the skull. It's not branched, does not have anything coming off of it. That is going to be your right internal carotid artery, number 1 here. All right, so the remaining artery, the external carotid, that's the one that has all the branches. All right, this is for arterial blood flow. Right now, I'll zoom back out. Make that disappear. Okay, so this first branch that comes off, you can see it's got these little branches going downwards. Right? That is going to be your right superior thyroid artery. Artery. Oh my gosh. Right? Because your thyroid gland sits down here. Okay. The next branch that we see that's coming off here, right, and it's going backwards, right? That's labeled number 4. That's the occipital artery. Look where it's going. Boom, right towards the occipital bone. Okay, so it's going to supply the posterior portion of your scalp back here. All right, so as we continue on, you can see this little artery coming out behind, right, the ramus of the mandible here, right, the mandibular condyle, right, and right behind that, number 3, that's your superficial temporal artery. That's the one that we saw that went up the side of your head. Okay, and then finally, we see it just kind of dipping out just a little bit over here by the mandibular notch. This little artery here, that's your maxillary artery. And that's going to supply all these structures up here by the maxillary bone and whatnot. Right? Keep in mind, you have to be able to tell me if it is the right occipital artery or the left occipital artery. Right? We will expect you to know that, and I expect you to know that this is the right side of the head. Okay? I don't want you to lose points on that. Okay. This is just double check, make sure. I'll do this real quick here. All right. Here's your common carotid. All right. It bifurcates. Here's the internal carotid artery going right here into the skull. All right. Here's our branch, our first branch off the. This is the external carotid right here. Here's our first branch, superior thyroid artery. Okay. Here is our right superficial temporal artery, and then here's our right maxillary artery here. But this one we didn't see before. Oh wait, also here's the right occipital artery, and then here you can see this nice vertebral artery right in the transverse foramina of the cervical bones here. Yep, the red. Yep, and that's going to be your vertebral artery. So here is the internal carotid. And that's supplying, well, the right internal carotid artery will supply 40% of the blood up to the brain there. And then this right vertebral artery is going to supply 10%. All right, so that's half of your blood supply to the brain right here, and they're in close proximation to one another. All right, so again, make sure that you know the right and left, okay? That's going to be key. It's huge. Huge, huge, huge. Okay, so let's talk about some of the blood vessels in the head, all right? And we're going to get into the actual internal portion here. All right, so first, keep in mind, all right, the internal carotid artery, all right, is going to enter into the skull through the carotid canal, all right? And then what will happen in there is it'll divide, all right? So we're going to see, all right, 2 of the branches here, the anterior and the middle cerebral arteries, they're going to supply the brain, all right? And then the ophthalmic artery, I think we can figure out what that's going to supply, all right? Eyes and the structures around the eyes, the muscles, some of the adipose tissue there and whatnot, okay? The other artery that goes up into the skull is the vertebral artery. You need to know it is this branch of the subclavian artery. It does not come off of the carotids. It is a branch of the subclavian artery. Where does it travel in the spine? In the transverse foramina. All right? It'll enter into the skull through the foramen magnum. The internal carotid, and I said this again, and I'll say it before, I'll say it again, through the carotid canal. Okay? So the left and right vertebral arteries, all right, merge together and they form what's called the basilar artery. The basilar artery gives off these little branches here, but the basilar artery will then split into our left and right posterior cerebral arteries. Okay. This is important because we're going to talk about this structure, this arterial structure called the circle of Willis. Right? And the circle of Willis is a really cool structure. It's inside, and it helps with blood flow to the brain here. Okay. So internal carotid artery, anterior medial cerebral arteries, and the ophthalmic artery comes off the internal carotid. This is all inside the skull. And then the other artery that enters into the skull is the vertebral artery. Okay, but that's a branch off the subclavian vein, or excuse me, subclavian artery. All right, so now we're going to talk about the circle of Willis. It's a really cool structure, and you need to know, all right, one of its big important functions is equalization of your blood pressure in your brain, right? And then we all know that blood flow is important to tissues. It's especially important to neurological tissues. They're super sensitive. So we need to make sure that if we get a blood clot, an aneurysm, all right, or a clogging of these blood vessels, that we have plenty of collateral circulation, meaning, all right, if blood vessel gets jammed up and clotted, the blood can find another way to get to that area that clogged up artery supplies. And so that's where our circle of Willis comes into play. So it's basically an anastomosis, right, of these arteries. And it sits around the sphenoid bone and the occipital bone, right, which is, remember the sella turcica, the Turkish saddle in which the pituitary gland sits in, okay? That's where we're going to find, all right, the circle of Willis. So what makes up the circle of Willis? All right, your posterior, anterior, and our internal carotid arteries are going to make up the majority of it, and then we have these smaller arteries called the posterior communicating and the anterior communicating. All right, so wait till you see it. It's easy for me to talk about it, but when you see it, it makes it a little bit easier to understand. Well, let's just check if you guys don't have this. So if you want, go ahead, feel free to take a picture, right? Because you may see this, right, on your exam. Okay. This right here, again, we've already talked about a bunch of this, but one of the ones that we didn't talk about, all right, was number 12 here, all right, the facial artery. And one of the things I want to point out to you is, all right, for the most part, when we're looking at some of these arteries, you notice how some of these are pretty straight, like here and here and here. But look at the facial artery, all right? It's kind of winding. You know why that is? Turn your head. You turn your head. That allows you to move your head around, and you have all that slack. If it was pretty much straight and you went to go turn your head, you would pinch that artery off, all right? Because that artery would get pressed against the ramus of your jaw here, or the body of the mandible, and it would get cut off. But that's another way that we used to use to tell the which one was the facial and which of these arteries was the lingual artery. The facial artery had more turns and bends in it. Okay. So this is what we're going to be looking at here. Here is, all right, the circle of Willis, this structure here. Okay, and you can see what it's made up of. Here's your internal carotid artery, all right, and then you've got your posterior arteries down here, and then your anterior arteries up here. Anterior cerebral, excuse me. Anterior cerebral, posterior cerebral, internal carotid, and then the middle cerebral arteries that come off of that. Then you have these tiny, small, little arteries here. All right, these are the posterior communicating arteries. This is the anterior communicating arteries. But the point being is, all these come together to form, all right, the circle of Willis, which I'll show you on yours here. Okay. You know what? I have to assume that it was named after the guy that, I won't say discovered it, but started labeling it. Most of the times, and you'll see if you have a named structure or like the Langerhans cells. If you remember the Langerhans cells, those are those dendritic cells, or those immune cells that sat in the epidermis. Again, you'll find certain structures, Langerhans, named after, for, I'm assuming, I say doctor, but probably the medical person or the scientist that discovered those structures. Okay, so quickly, when we're looking at the circle of Willis, you have to notice here at the base of our skull, you've got these two arteries coming in together. And these are your right and left, all right, vertebral arteries. So they were traveling up the transverse foramina. They entered into the skull through the foramen ovale, through the foramen magnum. They come together and fuse to form number 4 here. That's the basilar artery. Okay? Then the basilar artery splits off, okay, into the right and left cerebral arteries. And so they go all the way out here. Zoom in one. One second. Okay. So here is the right cerebral artery, and here's the left cerebral artery. Okay, so they go off to the side there. Then, if we're moving up further, you can see here, it's tough to see, but where number 3 is indicating, that is the internal carotid artery. Really, really tough to see. The internal carotid artery is going to give off the anterior cerebral and the middle cerebral. So number 1 is going to be the anterior cerebral. That's a branch off the internal carotid. And then this one here, number 2, that's the middle cerebral. But you can see the anterior cerebral artery makes up part of the circle of Willis. Here's the other middle cerebral artery. And did I hit them all? Anterior cerebral, middle, internal. Okay, yep. Medial, posterior. All right, so we're missing, because there's more than just, there's 2 other structures that are part of the circle of Willis. The anterior and posterior communicating arteries. I'll show you those here. Okay, pointing to, right up here, that is the anterior communicating. And then right here, I'll zoom in so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so here's the anterior communicating artery. Connects both of the anterior cerebral arteries, the left and the right. And then right here, here's the middle cerebral artery. Here's the posterior cerebral artery. Well, pretty much this little guy right here in between, that's the posterior communicating, right here and here. So this is the left posterior cerebral artery. Then this right here is the left posterior communicating artery. And then you have your left middle cerebral artery, and then your left anterior cerebral artery. And then you've got your anterior communicating artery. So all those make the circle of Willis. Okay. Questions? You'll see at least 3 or 4 questions on that. Okay. So let's get, now we talk about the arterial blood flow. So if we talk about the oxygenated arterial blood flow, now we got to talk about the venous blood flow, the deoxygenated return. Okay? Remember, what comes up must come down. What goes up must come down. So when we're talking about the head and neck, all right, we're going to talk about, all right, the blood vessels that are going to be draining these structures, primarily made up of the vertebral vein. Okay, we know where that runs. That's going to be in the cervical spine. And then we have both the external and the internal jugular veins. Okay, so remember, the vertebral artery was a branch off the subclavian artery, while the vertebral vein drains into the subclavian vein. Right? Now, also another vein that drains into the subclavian vein is the external jugular vein. The internal jugular vein, all right, which is going to carry most of the blood from the internal portion of the cranial cavity, all right, that is going to merge, all right, with the subclavian vein to form the brachiocephalic vein. Okay, so it doesn't form, now, not to be confused, this is where some people get confused. The internal and external carotid arteries, all right, are branches of, they come off, or where the common carotid artery bifurcates. The internal and external jugular veins, all right, don't come off of a common jugular vein, okay? They don't. They drain into something different, all right? The external jugular vein drains into the subclavian vein. The subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein come together and they form the brachiocephalic vein. Both the left and right brachiocephalic veins join together and make, remember, superior vena cava. Okay, the superior vena cava. So here's the superior vena cava. Okay, then you have your right brachiocephalic vein, the left brachiocephalic vein. All right, and then the internal jugular comes off. At that point, then this is known as the subclavian vein. All right, same thing here. We get another internal jugular vein, and at this point, that vein is known as the subclavian vein. And then the external jugular comes off of the subclavian vein. Okay, I shouldn't say it comes off of because it's actually drains into. I have to be careful with my wording there. All right, this is in your book. All right, so we talked about how the circle of Willis supplies blood to the cranial cavity. Now we've got to figure out how some of this blood is drained from the cranial cavity. And guess what? You know some of that because you took 211. You're taking 211. You took 210. Remember the dural septa? Remember those, the meningeal layers that we found? Remember the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, and then the, why am I having problems trying to remember the name of this right now? It'll come. Oh, well, I don't, I'm not on my game tonight, but no worries. Anyways, so when we're talking about the cranial cavity and its drainage, all right, the vertebral veins are going to play a role in some of that. Okay, but a majority of the blood gets drained through the dural venous sinuses. The dural venous sinuses, remember the dura mater had two layers. It had the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. And they fuse together most of the times, but sometimes they'll split apart and they'll create these cavities, these small spaces. Well, these spaces, all right, we call those sinuses, all right, and up there in the skull, all right, they're modified veins, and the reason why we call them modified veins, these don't have valves in them. Remember, veins have valves, okay? These don't. Okay, so where those two layers of the dura mater split apart, they have these spaces, and these sinuses is where that deoxygenated venous blood will drain into. And also, we'll find cerebrospinal fluid in there. Remember that little system there? It looked like a mushroom cap, all right? And we called those the arachnoid villi. And what would happen is when the cerebrospinal fluid pressure got too high, it would push up on this mushroom cap, all right? And it would separate the two cells that made that mushroom cap, and that excess cerebrospinal fluid would get pumped out into these dural venous sinuses. And then when that pressure decreased, all right, it would stop pushing out, and those cells would just collapse over the opening there, not to let any backflow to get in there. These dural venous sinuses will then eventually drain into the internal jugular veins. Okay, so let's take a peek. So this right here, now this should probably come back to you, seeing some of this stuff here. All right, so these blue vessel-like structures represent those spaces. Okay, so on the top portion here, all right, along the sagittal area, that's our superior sagittal sinus, and then below we have our inferior sagittal sinus. Falx cerebri. I can't believe it took me a second there, dude. All right, the falx cerebri is the name of this dural septa here. That's just dense connective tissue. All right, and so where it's separated above here, that's the superior sagittal sinus. Where it separates down here at the bottom, That's the inferior sagittal sinus. And then they'll drain down here into the straight sinus here, right? And then eventually it'll drain into the occipital and the transverse sinuses, and then eventually into the sigmoid. I'll show you. All right, that is not in your book. You might want to, if you want to, feel free, you can take a picture of that, okay? What this is showing us are all the venous drainage here, okay? This top one here is the superior sagittal sinus. Here's the inferior sagittal sinuses. Both of these will drain back into our straight sinus. All right, the straight sinus, along with the superior sagittal sinus, all right, they will drain into the transverse sinus, which is, if we're looking down on the cranial cavity here, the transverse sinus run along the lateral border here. The superior, this is your nose. Okay, then you have the superior sagittal sinus that runs down the middle, and then right below it is the inferior sagittal sinus. These transverse sinuses will sit here off on the side, and what they'll do is they'll drain into the sigmoid sinuses here towards the center, and then eventually that sigmoid sinus, all right, will form the internal jugular vein and drain out through the neck. Okay, here you can see the vertebral, all right, vein right here, entering up again. Same thing, transverse foramina, all right, enters into the foramen magnum, all right, and then you can have your sigmoid sinus is going to be draining into the vertebral vein and also here into the internal jugular vein. There you go. That should look familiar to you because you had that from last semester, from 210. Okay. So you'll see something like this on the test, all right? So here's the falx cerebri here, that connective tissue, all right? And where it's the two layers separate up top here, that's the superior sagittal sinus. Then you have much smaller down here, the inferior sagittal sinus, all right? And then where the falx cerebri meets the tentorium cerebelli, again, that's another dense connective tissue, dural septa, all right? It will form, right, the straight sinus here. And you can't really tell because it's not the best, but along the margin here, right here, right where that arrow is pointing to, that's the transverse sinus. Okay, questions so far? When I start doing this is where I always lose people. It's like finding a person that likes to talk about maps and street signs and all that stuff. You know, how long could you listen to somebody rambling on about, you know, taking this road to this next road to this next road to this destination here? That's kind of how I look at it. All right, so let's move back down here into the thorax and the abdominal region here. We're going to talk about this guy right here, the internal thoracic artery. All right, the internal thoracic artery is going to supply, all right, the anterior portion of your thoracic wall, so the front part of your rib cage and the sternum and whatnot, all right? And so this doesn't really apply to me, and also the mammary glands, okay? So it's going to be the front of your chest, think of it. It's a branch off the subclavian artery, all right? So now we have a branch that's coming off the front portion, right, of the subclavian artery. It's going to be found more towards the anterior portion of your chest. And it's going to give off, all right, 6 smaller arteries. And it's these smaller arteries that we name them the intercostal arteries because they will actually be found on the inferior portion of the rib. The descending thoracic aorta gave off the posterior intercostal arteries. The internal thoracic artery is going to give off the anterior intercostal arteries. And they're going to anastomose with one another. They're going to meet up, okay? So the last branch off of the internal thoracic artery is, we refer to that as the musculophrenic. When you see phrenic, what do you think? Phrenic is? Oh, good. See, we're synced. Remember the phrenic nerve? From 210, the phrenic nerve is going, it sits, I mean, you're touching your neck. Yeah, it sits on your subclavian, it sits on the scalene, the anterior scalene muscle. And it actually innervates the muscle of breathing, which is diaphragm. Diaphragm, yeah. So the musculophrenic artery, all right, this is going to be heading down towards the diaphragm, okay? And so it divides into 3 other arteries, okay, for 7 through 9 intercostal spaces. And then the last major part of the internal thoracic artery is known as the superior epigastric artery, and this is going to supply, all right, the top portion of your abdominal wall, okay, pretty much everything above the belly button, okay? So it's always easier to show you a picture. I'll come right back to that. Where are you? Here we go. Okay, so here's the subclavian artery, and it gives off the internal, all right, thoracic artery, okay, and it travels down. Is the door locked? Okay, so you can see it better on this side here. Here's the internal thoracic artery, right? So it travels down, and it's going to give off, all right, 6 branches, all right, and these 6 branches will travel on the underside here, all right, of the ribs. And they're going to meet up with the posterior intercostal arteries on the backside, okay? So you can see here on our descending thoracic aorta, all right, you can see these the posterior intercostal arteries, which are coming off and starting on the back portions of the ribs. Well, the internal thoracic artery gives off the anterior intercostal arteries for the first 6, all right, intercostal spaces here. As we descend further down, all right, you'll see that intercostal spaces 7 through 9 are going to be given off by the musculophrenic artery. And then we further go down, it's like the last branch that the internal thoracic artery gives off, right? That's going to be your superior epigastric artery. And that's pretty much going to supply the abdominal wall, right? Pretty much everything above the belly button, right in through here. Okay? That's going to anastomose, all right, with the inferior epigastric artery, which is a branch off of the external iliac artery. Okay? We'll talk about that in a second. All right. Okay. So let's talk about the inferior epigastric artery. Okay. This artery again comes off of the external iliac. It's going to anastomose with the superior epigastric artery, but it's going to supply the inferior abdominal wall, pretty much everything from the belly button down on the anterior lateral portion of the abdominal wall there, okay, and some of the internal structures there, okay. Then we have another artery, go back up to the top here, what we call the supreme intercostal artery. This guy is a branch of our costal cervical trunk. The costal cervical trunk comes off of the subclavian artery. All right, and so it's going to give off 2 branches, the supreme intercostal artery, the first and second posterior intercostal arteries. All right, and then we're going to see, remember I was showing you on that picture, and I'll go back to it in a second, all right, we've got the descending thoracic aorta is going to give off the posterior intercostal arteries. And this is something I mentioned before, make sure you know that, all right, that the posterior intercostal and the anterior intercostal are going to anastomose. They're going to hook up. They're going to connect with one another, okay? So you're going to have blood coming from the descending thoracic aorta, all right? It's going to supply and be pumped through the posterior intercostal arteries, and then you're going to have the internal thoracic along with the supreme intercostal artery. That's going to supply, all right, the blood to those anterior intercostal arteries. So that's what I was showing you here. All right, so here is the costal cervical trunk right here, and one of the branches that comes off of it, all right, is going to be that supreme intercostal artery that will then split off into the first and second posterior intercostal arteries. And then the remaining, All right, you see all these posterior intercostal arteries here are coming off of the descending thoracic aorta. Okay, and it's just going to wrap around here to the front, all right, and anastomose with the anterior intercostal arteries. All right. When we're in the when we're in the abdominal cavity, if we follow the descending thoracic aorta down into the abdominal cavity, all right, so this is your abdominal, the ADA we'll call it, abdominal descending aorta, right, before it splits into your common iliacs, right, it gives off the lumbar arteries, okay, about 5 branches that come off. Okay, and so, I don't know why I made that one small. All right, but they're going to supply the posterior abdominal wall, the lateral portion of the abdominal wall. All right, and then finally, at the bifurcation, you have this tiny little artery that just comes right off the middle. It sits right in front of the sacrum there. Okay, it goes down towards the tailbone of the coccyx, and that's the median sacral artery. All right, so you'll see that at the bifurcation of the aorta, before it splits off into the common iliacs, the right and left common iliacs. That's what we're going to see down here. Okay, so here you can see the lumbar arteries being given off, right? And then we have our bifurcation here of the descending abdominal aorta, and then right here, right, is that median sacral artery. So it's right in front of the sacrum here. And again, you can see, all right, this is in our inferior epigastric artery, comes off the external iliac artery, and it's going to anastomose with the superior epigastric artery, which is that final branch off of the internal thoracic artery. All right, so that's arterial blood supply. So what are we going to do now? Now we're going to talk about the venous drainage, okay? Similar, but not exactly, because we're going to get a little, let me see something, hold on one second. You know what? I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop because I have a feeling that you guys are probably full. You need to probably go empty your brains. But let's stop here because I want to hold up on this information here. Okay, because when we get into the azygous veins and in the hemiazygous, it throws a whole new wrench into things. I want your brain's fresh when we talk about this stuff. Okay, so make sure that you go home, you de-stress yourself, you get plenty of sleep. Okay, you don't want anybody having any type of fibrillation there. All right, premature ventricular contractions, all that fun stuff. All right, no stimulants before you go to bed.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that. How do we